behind me. They could be dangerous.
Speak, you ancient miscreants!
Hey, what's up?
When it comes to classic horror monsters, the mummy's always been sort of an enigma to me. Like most people, I knew a little bit about historical mummies, but I never knew what was going on with the mummy monster. And from my observations with pop culture, the mummy is a monster never seemed as popular as its peers, like vampires or werewolves. I thought diving into the mummy's history would help get to the bottom of this, but the more I researched, the more questions I had. The Mummy started as a 1932 horror film, but the Mummy as we know today has shifted away from its original roots. The most iconic Mummy to me is the '99 film, but that version shares more in common with Indiana Jones than the original Mummy film. And adding to the conundrum is the 2017 Mummy, which doesn't share much in common with any Mummy film. So, it begs the question, where did this all begin? What was the original Mummy, and why does the Mummy mythos seem so flexible? And by getting to the bottom of these questions, we can get a little closer to the more pressing one. Why has the Mummy, as a character, creature, and franchise, seemingly failed to match other figures in popularity? The history of the Mummy films is quite the journey, and in many ways, the actual history is way more fascinating than the films themselves. Like any character in mythos, the Mummy's changed a lot over time, and it's seen everything from classic horror to something even more horrifying. Like with any story, it's best to start at the very beginning. When compared to Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein, the Mummy is unique in that it's mostly original. Dracula and Frankenstein were loosely based on books and stage plays, but the Mummy's origin is a little more complicated, and the original version didn't even include a traditional mummy. But in order to get into that, we have to wind the clocks back to 1922, when archaeologists made the monumental discovery of King Tutankhamun. The discovery of King Tut was all the rage back then, which led to a renewed interest in ancient Egypt, and more importantly, whispers of curses and other superstitions. And in response to the public fervor, Universal Studios thought, hey, we should make an Egyptian-themed horror film. But even though Universal had an idea in mind, they didn't really have a good starting point. The writers at Universal tried to find mummy stories to adapt, but there weren't that many to work with the only examples being a few short stories by Arthur Conan Doyle and a novel by Bram Stoker. But while these stories may have played a role in the final script, the actual story for the Mummy began as another story altogether. The original story began as a 9-page story called Cagliostro, named after a famous explorer and self-proclaimed magician. In the short story, Cagliostro is a 3,000-year-old magician who stayed alive through the power of science, and he spends his days living in modern-day San Francisco. At some point during his life, Cagliostro had a bad experience with a lover, and as a result, he ends up spending the rest of his life terrorizing any woman who reminds him of her. But despite the comical premise, Cagliostro was close to full production, and Universal even brought back Boris Karloff to play the titular character. The film didn't change until Universal hired John L. Balderston, the same writer who worked on Dracula and Frankenstein. Balderston then took the original Cagliostro story, added in plot elements from Dracula, and rewrote various parts of the original story. For example, the magician's origin was changed to be more supernatural, the setting was moved from SF to Cairo, and the scorned lover angle was revised. And lastly, both the title and titular character were changed, with Cagliostro being renamed to Imhotep, and the title being changed to The Mummy. As for the Mummy itself, the film begins the way you'd expect. The film opens with a team of archaeologists discussing their various findings, the most noteworthy being a mummified man and a mysterious casket. From what they could research, the mummy is an Egyptian priest named Imhotep, and he seems to have been buried alive for unknown reasons. But one curious researcher examines the casket alongside Imhotep, and inside, he finds an ancient scroll. Unbeknownst to him, the scroll is a magical artifact known as the Scroll of Thoth, a relic that can give life to the dead. Naturally, the researcher reads from the scroll, which inadvertently brings Imhotep back to life. Imhotep then departs, but not before scaring the living daylights out of the archaeologist. But after Imhotep vanishes, 10 years pass, and the film moves to another team led by Frank, the son of the researcher who discovered Imhotep. But unlike his father, Frank hasn't made any great discoveries, and as he's lamenting his poor fortunes, he's greeted by an Egyptian man named Ardith Bey. Bey then approaches Frank with an intriguing proposition. According to Bey, he's discovered the site of an Egyptian princess named Ankhsenamun, but unable to excavate the site himself due to cultural beliefs in Egypt. Bey explains that he's willing to share his findings with the team, and furthermore, they'll be allowed to take full credit for the discovery.
Okay, I believe you.
The deal is a little too good to be true, but due to having no sensational findings of their own, Frank and the team gladly accept. But as the film progresses, the true nature of Bey and his motivations are revealed. Ardith Bey is later revealed to be the mummy Imhotep, and he's been living in present-day Cairo ever since his revival. While he lives under the guise of a mild-mannered Egyptian historian, his true goal is to find the princess Ankhsenamun, with the hope of one day bringing her back to life. As the film explains, Imhotep was once in love with the princess, and following her death, he stole both her body and the Scroll of Thoth, all in an effort to revive her. However, Imhotep was captured before he could finish the ritual, and as punishment for his transgressions, he was put to death via live burial. It isn't until the present day where Imhotep finally discovers the tomb of the princess, and just like before, he intends to bring her back to life. But Imhotep only has the body of Ankhsenamen, and in order to revive her, he also needs her soul, a soul that currently resides in a living woman. It's later revealed that another character, Helen, is actually the modern-day reincarnation of Ankhsenamen, and in order to bring Ankhsenamen back to life, Helen must perish, which will release the soul of the princess. Obviously, Helen isn't pleased with this revelation, and all of this comes to a head in the film's final sequence. Imhotep is only one stab away from finishing the ritual, but Helen responds by searching her ancestral memories and praying to the goddess Isis for help. The goddess answers, and through literal divine intervention, the Scroll of Thoth is destroyed, sending the mummy back to the grave for good. Now, there's a lot to unpack with the original Mummy, but it's interesting how the film approached the mummy in question. While the mummy was advertised as this monster wrapped in bandages, he's not really a monster in the traditional sense. Imhotep is really just a magician who is buried alive, and his powers lie less in brute strength, but magic and deception. And this creates a different kind of film compared to other classic horror movies, where the main villain isn't this monstrous being, but more of a hidden manipulator. But this segues into one of the main issues with the film. The Mummy is unique in that compared to Dracula and Frankenstein, it doesn't feel like a strict horror film. This movie feels like a hybrid between horror, mystery, and drama, and not every aspect feels fully developed. Of the three elements at play, the strongest in my opinion are the mystery aspects. The Mummy does an excellent job at setting up various plot points and slowly giving the audience more information throughout the film. For example, Imhotep's backstory is alluded to very early, and the film gradually gives you more pieces to the puzzle, like the Tomb of Ankhsenamen and Helen's disdain for modern Egypt. But horror and drama are where the Mummy tends to falter. The Mummy does feel scary at times, but it doesn't maintain that feeling throughout the film. For example, I personally think the scariest part of the film was near the beginning, shortly after Imhotep's revival. The sheer presence of Imhotep is enough to scare a man so much, he goes crazy, and I love how the scene has that slow, sinister tension. But after the opening scene, the horror elements take a backseat, and the mystery and drama are pulled to the forefront. The film never quite feels scary, or at least as scary as it was in the opening. Most of the Mummy feels more creepy than scary, like the feeling that something scary might happen, when in reality, the most that's happening are characters talking with each other. It also doesn't help that Imhotep's main way of killing is remote magic, which feels way less raw and visceral compared to killing someone in person. For example, it feels really unsettling when you watch Dracula and see him physically drain someone, or when you watch Frankenstein and see the aftermath of a struggle, whereas watching Imhotep use magic just doesn't feel the same. And to give you another example, Imhotep actually does kill someone in person, and it's one of the last times the film feels genuinely scary. Now, I'm not saying Imhotep should have gone around strangling people, but I'd have liked to see a bit more horror in this horror film. Part of the reason I like the opening so much is because it's slower, more subdued, and has a palpable tension throughout the scene. And the end result isn't even a murder, it's a straight up Lovecraftian breakdown. The opening sequence is a great example of that slow, creeping feeling, followed immediately with something shocking, and I was hoping to see more of that throughout the film. And with regards to the Mummy's drama, it's honestly really underbaked. The core conflict in the Mummy is this notion of the past versus the present, and this is best seen in the character of Helen. Despite being a modern day woman, Helen feels an intense connection to ancient Egypt, and later, Imhotep himself. All of which is due to her being the reincarnation of an Egyptian princess. But even though Helen feels drawn to the past, it's ultimately her feelings for Frank that pull her back to reality.
Because I'd rather die than live and lose you.
We're not going to lose each other.
Because of Frank, Helen learns to appreciate the present instead of longing for the past, which culminates in her rejecting Imhotep and stopping the ritual.
I loved you once, but now you belong with the dead.
But the issue here is that Frank and Helen's relationship just isn't very well developed. Frank doesn't even seem to be in love with Helen, but rather Helen's great-great-great-great-grandma. I'm not joking, by the way, you can hear for yourself.
When we got the wrappings off, and I saw her face, you'll think me silly, but I sort of fell in love with her.
What the f?
I wouldn't mind this romance if it were like a minor subplot, but it ends up being a central aspect of Helen's character, and a central aspect of the film overall. But all that being said, I should mention that critiquing an older film through a modern lens is always tricky, as older films weren't made with the same mindsets they are now. Movies were shorter, expectations were different, and what isn't scary to me now could be terrifying to someone back in the 1930s. And credit where credit is due, the story for the 1932 Mummy is really unique, and it's way more creative than a lot of modern films. If anything, I think I just wanted more of what this film was offering. I like how the Mummy was going for a more subdued kind of horror, where the villain schemes and lurks in the shadows. And while I criticize the drama and romance, I still think the ideas work great in theory. The ideas in the original Mummy are really good, and many of the film's issues lie less with the ideas, and more with how the core ideas are presented. And despite any of the film's shortcomings, the 1932 Mummy was still fairly successful. The original film never received a true sequel, but in 1940, Universal released The Mummy's Hand, a new story that featured a mummy named Karis. The Mummy's Hand went on to have 3 more sequels, and a British version simply called The Mummy, which combined elements from The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Tomb, and The Mummy's Ghost. And in contrast to the original Mummy, the Karras films are much more like classic horror movies, complete with simple storylines, gruesome deaths, and an imposing monster. And you know how the most popular idea of a mummy is this figure shambling out of a coffin? Most of that imagery actually comes from the Karras films. While Imhotep was more of a magician, Karras is a strong, lumbering brute, and he fits the mold of classic monster more than Imhotep ever did. And despite the change in mummy and style, the Karras films were also decently successful for a few years. But following a brief stint in the 50s with Abbott and Costello, the Mummy would take a long hiatus for a few decades, and it wouldn't be until 1980 when Universal decided to revisit the classic character. Supposedly, the Mummy was meant to be remade for a new era, and there were many pitches for how this film would come to fruition. Initial ideas included everything from a low-budget horror film, a zombie film, or a modern-day romance. But it took a long time for any idea to actually move to production, and the new Mummy film had problems ranging from script rewrites, budget changes, and directors joining and leaving the project altogether. Universal wouldn't settle on a definitive vision until the late 90s, and the end result was something radically different than every film so far. When compared to the 1932 film, the 99 Mummy shares only a handful of similarities. For example, the mummy in question is Imhotep again, and he shares the same basic backstory as the original version. But while this film started as a 1932 remake, it's more accurate to say that it's a reinterpretation. There are similar characters and plot points compared to the original film, but a vast majority of them have been repurposed altogether, like how Ardith Bay is now a separate, distinct character, and how the female lead isn't the reincarnation of Imhotep's lover, but still plays a role in the resurrection ritual. But the most stark change with this film was the choice of genre. The 99 Mummy isn't a horror film like the original, it's an adventure movie reminiscent of films like Raiders of the Lost Ark. As such, comparing this film to the original feels like a serious case of apples and oranges, as one film was an eerie horror drama, and the other is a campy, swashbuckling romp.
Look at I got.
But despite the genre shift, the 99 Mummy doesn't ignore its horror roots. While most of the film is a fairly lighthearted adventure, there are many scenes that feel genuinely scary, and I definitely remember having a few nightmares when I was younger. And even though the first half is more of an adventure film, the second half is more reminiscent of the original Mummy, like the ritual sequence. Now, the 99 Mummy is a film that's remembered very fondly, and part of that is honestly due to nostalgia goggles. When I look at this movie more critically, I think some effects haven't aged the best, some set pieces drag a little too long, and the mummy in question isn't nearly as interesting as the original. But this movie is just so much fun, and that makes it hard to care about every little flaw. Yes, the movie is cheesy as hell, but it's just the right amount of cheese, and every cast member involved knows exactly what kind of movie they're in. And speaking of casting, it can't be overstated just how good the cast was. Almost every actor on screen oozes charisma, and they do an incredible job at selling the movie even at its corniest. Looking back, it's kind of a miracle this film was as good as it was, because there's so many ways it could have fallen apart. Reliance on CGI over practical effects, a script that took itself too seriously, a less charismatic cast,
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
and so on. And even the initial pitch for this movie was weird, because it sounds bizarre to take elements of a classic horror film, but tweak them for a pulpy adventure movie. And despite everything working against it, the 1999 Mummy just works. It's the kind of movie that feels like a relic of a bygone era, where films were shot on location, cast members had insane chemistry with each other, and the cheese and dorky one-liners felt completely natural. At the end of the day, movies are all about entertainment, and the 99 Mummy is the kind of film that delivers on that front. And it seems audiences everywhere felt the same. The film's critical reception wasn't too great, but it was a box office success, and the 99 Mummy went on to have 2 sequels, an animated series, and a bunch of garbage spin-offs. And even though the reception of later films never matched the first, the new Mummy franchise had the potential to go even further. After a third entry, Universal actually had plans for a Mummy 4, and this new adventure was meant to be set in South America. But sadly, this never came to pass, and the Mummy 4 spent years in limbo all the way until 2012. But by the time Universal wanted another Mummy film, they didn't want one with the O'Connell family. They wanted a reboot, and one that was meant to return the Mummy back to its darker roots. Allegedly. And just like the 99 Mummy, this version also had its fair share of production issues, like changes in director, changes in scripts, and changes in future plans for the franchise. Eventually, Universal did settle on a final vision, and just like the 99 film, the final product was yet another strange take on the Mummy mythos. What's interesting about the 2017 Mummy is that in terms of genre, it's almost like a fusion of past films. It's more horror-inspired like the original Mummy, but it also has action and adventure elements like the 99 film. But despite having some genre overlap, the 2017 Mummy actually shares very little in common with past films, so much that it feels less like a Mummy film, and more like a random action movie with a mummy in it. In contrast to the character of Imhotep, the mummy in this one is named Amenet. Unlike past mummies, Amenet's motivation doesn't come from love, but rather spite and religious zealotry. Amenet was once in line to be the successor to her father's kingdom, but everything changed with the birth of her brother, which gave the pharaoh a male heir to his kingdom. Out of anger, Amunet turned to the dark arts, and she resolved to get her revenge by bringing a dark god, Set, into the mortal realm. Her plans were eventually thwarted, and like the mummies of past films, her punishment is a live burial. Many centuries later, Amunet reawakens, and she intends to finish what she started long ago. But in order to bring the dark god into the world, she needs a vessel for the god to possess, which leads her to the character of Nick. Nick is a thief who helps in Amunet's discovery, and due to his physical fitness and flexible morality, Amunet sees him as a worthy vessel. Amunet later causes a plane crash that kills Nick, which in turn allows her to begin the ritual process. But the ritual is only partially complete, and the rest of the film involves Amunet trying to find Nick and finish the ritual. And while all of this is going on, a mysterious scientist is investigating both Amunet and Nick, for reasons unknown. The scientist later reveals himself to be Henry Jekyll. Yes, that Henry Jekyll. And he intends to recruit Nick into a secret club of monstrous figures. As for the actual quality of this film, I have no idea where to even begin. I mean, the story is serviceable, the horror elements are decent, and at least half the cast is trying to give a decent performance. But there's really no way to sugarcoat it. This movie is bad by any metric you could think of. The effects are marginally better than the '99 film, the characters are wooden and lifeless, and the script feels like it was written by a high schooler. But I think the worst issue is the film's tone. This film was advertised as a horror action adventure movie, but it doesn't balance each aspect well at all. You'll have scenes that feel creepy and grotesque, and within seconds, that feeling will be undercut with humor, whether it's a quippy one-liner or an entire tonal shift altogether. And this happens constantly, so much that it's hard to pick any one example within the film.
Jenny!
A thief, physically capable, compulsively devious, and utterly devoid of soul.
What?
What?
It's not me. It's you.
And this makes it really hard to take this film seriously, because anytime there's something remotely interesting happening, it's intercut with another stupid joke. And none of this would be a problem if, like the '99 film, the cheesy one-liners felt natural for the kind of film being shown. The '99 Mummy has one-liners and jokes all the time, but it feels natural because it's a cheesy and self-aware movie, and cracking jokes often feels like a natural quirk for most characters. For example, Rick is established early on as someone who doesn't take things too seriously, and because he doesn't take things too seriously, the audience isn't expected to either. But the 2017 Mummy is like the polar opposite, because the movie takes itself so seriously. The film really tries to make you believe things like, say, Jekyll being a tortured soul who wants to save the world, or Nick being someone torn between good and evil. And all of that sounds fine on paper, but in reality, the Jekyll plotline is awkward and distracting, while Nick has the personality of a Fire Emblem avatar. Seriously, I couldn't even remember the name of the main character, let alone any discernible traits he has. You could say similar things about all the characters, and that lack of personality across the board is what makes the quips feel so awkward. Unlike the '99 Mummy, it doesn't feel like you're watching a charming rogue trying to make light of a dark situation, or a bookworm who's slowly coming out of her shell. The 2017 Mummy feels like you're watching writers choose certain moments and told, please laugh now. I know this film is far from the worst movie out there, but honestly, there just aren't that many redeeming qualities. The humor is awful, the action is dull, and any emotional beats the film tries to invoke simply don't land. This movie feels like watching a bad horror movie and a bad superhero movie, and the sad part is that was partly by design. See, a few years ago, Universal wanted to cash in on the shared universe craze, and to do so, they had an idea to create something called the Dark Universe. Supposedly, the Dark Universe is meant to be a shared universe made up out of classic horror icons, like Henry Jekyll, Dracula, The Invisible Man, and so on. But thankfully, none of this would ever come to pass. The 2017 Mummy was slammed by critics everywhere, and on top of that, the film bombed at the box office. The poor reception of the film forced Universal to reevaluate their shared universe plan, and by 2019, they announced that the Dark Universe was officially cancelled. And when I look at a film like the 2017 Mummy, I'm sure there are many ways to make it work, like a more cohesive script, better character writing, or a different cast. But I think this movie was doomed the second it was planned to be part of a cinematic universe. One lesson that studios have failed to learn is that you can't force a shared universe, and before you even think about making one, you need a solid foundation to build off of. The only reason why the MCU even exists is because the original Iron Man was a good film that succeeded on its own merits, and so many studios have tried and failed to take shortcuts, all for the promise of big profits. Could a movie like The Mummy work as a branching point for a shared universe? Sure. After all, Universal is the great grandfather of cinematic universes, and a reimagining of classic monsters could do well in the modern era. And even beyond Universal, films like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or the TV series Penny Dreadful show how these characters can exist in the same world. And even though I critique the film's issues with tone, it absolutely could have worked in the right circumstances. Part of the reason why people love the '99 Mummy is because it could be funny, thrilling, and scary, and there's no reason why the 2017 Mummy couldn't do the same. I'm sure there's a version of the 2017 Mummy that could have worked, but not this one. It's one of the most soulless movies I've ever seen, and as bad as it sounds to say, I'm really glad it failed. A film like this needs to serve as a reminder of why forcing a shared universe is a terrible idea. And whenever another studio thinks about making a shared universe, I hope they remember the 2017 Mummy, a film that was so bad, it killed a universe before it could even begin. And after almost a century of Mummy movies, where does that leave the Mummy? The Mummy franchise, for lack of a better term, is fascinating in how it shows how films change and evolve over time. The original Mummy takes inspiration from classic horror films, while the '99 version pays homage to campy adventure movies. And of course, the 2017 version was a reflection of what's popular around the time, namely superheroes and shared universes. And yet, this leads back to the question I posed earlier. I originally began this project in hopes of figuring out why the Mummy doesn't seem very popular. And while I don't have a concrete answer, I think I have two hypotheses. The first is that the Mummy doesn't have a strong foundation to build from. Unlike Dracula and Frankenstein, the Mummy has no definitive story, and while you don't need source material to make a good film, it helps. But adding to this is how fractured the original film was. The original Mummy is this makeshift tale with different elements smashed together, like the original Cagliostro story, plot points from Dracula, and concepts from Doyle's The Ring of Thoth. And the final nail in the coffin, no pun intended, is how the Mummy originated. The entire reason why the Mummy exists was to chase what was popular back then, namely the success of other, better films, and the public's fascination with Egyptian superstition. So when you look at the Mummy's foundation, all you have is this patchwork story, born from a desire to chase popularity. And honestly, the Mummy franchise as a whole strikes me as the ultimate bandwagon hopper. The Mummy films are never the trendsetters, they're the trend followers, and it's been that way from the very beginning. Whether it's horror films, adventure films, or superhero films, the Mummy's always there to cash in on the next big thing. But that said, the other hypothesis regarding the Mummy's popularity is much more straightforward. The Mummy as a monster simply isn't that interesting. When you look at other famous horror monsters, they almost always have something that sets them apart. Vampires have unique powers, Frankenstein's monster has an iconic design, and even werewolves have a basic mythos most people know about. But the mummies in film don't really have much going for them. The mummy designs aren't as visually striking as other monsters, and their power sets range from being generic to outlandish and over the top. And the mummies overall don't have an interesting mythos, as almost all of them can be summed up like this. Once upon a time in Egypt, someone messed up and got buried alive. As for the future of the mummy, it's hard to say. I think it's safe to say that the mummy is likely going to stay dormant for a while, but as we've seen, it's only a matter of time until it returns, whether it's in the next 5, 10, or 50 years. And even though the '99 version was very different compared to the original, I also think it was a good approach for the mummy concept. Stories always change with the times, and it's only natural to change things to fit the current audience. As long as the final product is good, audiences will be receptive. And that last part is important, because otherwise, you get the 2017 Mummy, and we really don't need another one of those. But I'm personally hoping for a version like the original film. There's a lot of really good material in the original Mummy, like the slower kind of horror, the themes, or the drama, all of which could do well in the modern era. More than anything, the Mummy needs a proper, definitive movie, and it just needs someone with the right vision to make that a reality. Now, the odds of that happening probably aren't very high, but hey, we'll just have to wait and see.